He ran an empire built on silence, fear, and absolute control. No one questioned him. No one challenged him. No one got close to him. Until she walked in. And everything he had spent 20 years building, began to unravel because of one single emotion he never saw coming. Jealousy. Stay with us, because this story will break your heart before it heals it. Welcome back to Dad Life Stories, the channel where real human emotions meet the most extraordinary lives. Today, we're diving deep into a story that feels like it was pulled straight from the pages of a Korean crime drama. But this isn't fiction. This is the documented, verified, astonishing true account of one of South Korea's most powerful underground figures, a man known in the streets of Seoul simply as Hyungnim, meaning Big Brother, a title that carried as much reverence as it did terror. His real name was Park Junho, and for over 2 decades he was untouchable. He had judges in his pocket, police commissioners who looked the other way, and business moguls who shook his hand at dinner parties they'd later pretend they never attended. Park Junho moved through the world of organized crime in South Korea the way a shadow moves across a wall, quietly, powerfully, and without leaving a trace. But shadows have edges. And when the light finally found the woman standing in that light was someone nobody expected. Her name was Lee Suyin. She was not a crime boss. She was not an informant. She was not a government agent hiding behind a pretty face. She was a florist. A florist. And somehow, this ordinary woman from a small shop in the Mapo district of Seoul managed to do what entire law enforcement agencies had failed to do for 22 years. She made Park Junho feel something. And that feeling, that deeply buried, fiercely protected, violently denied feeling, would eventually cost him everything. This is their story, and you're going to want to watch every single second of it. To understand what happened between Park Junho and Lee Suyin, you first have to understand who Park Junho actually was. Because the man the newspapers eventually called the Ghost of Gangnam didn't start his life in boardrooms and black SUVs. He started it in poverty. Born in 1971 in a cramped apartment in Incheon, a port city just west of Seoul, Park Junho was the second of 4 children. His father worked the docks. His mother took in laundry. They were not violent people. They were tired people, worn thin by a country still healing from decades of hardship, doing everything they could to keep 4 children fed and clothed. But Junho noticed something early on. He noticed that the men in his neighborhood who ate the best meals, who wore the cleanest clothes, who walked with their chins up, those men were not factory workers. Those men were not dock workers. Those men worked for someone in ways that were never discussed out loud. He was 12 years old when he first ran a message for one of those men. Just a folded piece of paper. A few bucks. A few won in payment. But something in that exchange, the secrecy of it, the importance of it, the feeling of being trusted with something that mattered, lit a fire inside young Junho that nothing in school, nothing at church, nothing in his ordinary life ever had. By 15, he was running small errands for a local gang leader named Choi Bogum, a stocky, tattooed man who controlled petty gambling operations along the Incheon waterfront. Junho was quick, quiet, and frighteningly observant. He watched everything. He remembered everything. And he never, ever made the same mistake twice. By 19, he had outgrown Choi Bogum's operation entirely. Not by betraying his mentor. That was not Junho's style. He waited. He planned. And when Choi Bogum was arrested on embezzlement charges in the spring of 1990, Junho stepped into the vacuum with surgical precision. Within 6 months, he had reorganized the entire waterfront operation, doubled the revenue, and quietly absorbed 2 competing factions without a single drop of blood being spilled. That was what made him different. In a world where power was usually proven with violence, Park Junho proved his with intelligence. He studied. He read. He took night classes in business administration. He understood contracts, accounting, and leverage in ways that most of his contemporaries simply couldn't match. By the time he was 30, he had moved from Incheon to Seoul. And Seoul, for a man like Junho, was not a city. It was a chessboard. He built what law enforcement would later call one of the most sophisticated criminal networks in modern South Korean history, a layered organization that operated simultaneously through legitimate businesses and hidden financial channels. Real estate companies, entertainment agencies, import-export firms, all of them functioning properly on the surface, all of them serving a deeper function underneath. He employed hundreds of people who had no idea who they truly worked for. He attended charity galas and donated generously to children's hospitals. He was photographed smiling at ribbon-cutting ceremonies. He was, to all visible appearances, a successful and civic-minded businessman. But in the circles that knew, in the underground corridors of South Korea's criminal world, Park Junho was the name. The one spoken with lowered voices and careful eyes. The one whose calls were always returned. The one whose decisions were never challenged. And through all of it, through 22 years of power and precision and careful, calculated living, Park Junho had one absolute rule. Never let anyone close. No wife. No family of his own. No emotional entanglements. Relationships, in his experience, were liabilities. Love was a vulnerability. And vulnerability, in his world, was death. He had seen it happen to others. Good men, smart men, undone by a woman's tears, a child's kidnapping, a lover's betrayal. Every weakness of the heart was a door left unlocked, and Park Junho had made sure for over 2 decades that every door inside him was bolted shut. Until the morning, he walked into a small flower shop on a quiet street in Mapo, trying to order a funeral arrangement for one of his associates, and met Lee Suyin. Lee Suyin was 34 years old. She had grown up in Jeonju in the southwestern part of South Korea, a city famous for its traditional culture, its beautiful Hanok villages, and its extraordinary food. Her parents had run a small greenhouse on the edge of the city, and from the time she could walk, Suyin had grown up with soil under her fingernails and the smell of green things living and breathing all around her. She loved flowers the way some people love music, not as decoration, not as commodity, but as language, as feeling, as a way of saying the things that words couldn't carry. She moved to Seoul at 26, following a relationship that ultimately didn't survive the city's relentless pace. The relationship ended, but Suyin stayed. She found a small lease on a shop space in Mapo, a neighborhood with a mix of young professionals, older families, and artists, and opened Suyin's flowers with a hand-painted sign and exactly 11 types of blossoms. The shop grew slowly, honestly, through word of mouth, and the genuine warmth that every customer could feel the moment they stepped through the door. Suyin had something rare in a city as fast and transactional as Seoul. She was present. When you spoke to her, she looked at you, really looked at you, like what you were saying was the most important thing she'd heard all week. She remembered your mother's favorite flower. She remembered that you'd been through a difficult year. She remembered that yellow roses made you sneeze. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped traffic. She was beautiful in the way that made you want to sit down and stay a while. Dark eyes that held warmth like coals hold heat, deeply, quietly for a long time. A laugh that arrived without warning and left the air feeling lighter. She had been married once, briefly, unhappily, to a man in the finance industry who had spent their 3 years together talking primarily about himself and his portfolio. The divorce had been quiet, civil, and Suyin had emerged from it with a kind of hard-won clarity about herself, about what she needed, what she would accept, and what she absolutely would not. She was not looking for love. She was not lonely in the bitter, desperate sense. She was simply living her life, one arrangement at a time, one customer at a time, one careful, blooming day at a time. That was the woman Park Junho walked in on a Thursday morning in March, 22 years into his empire, carrying his phone in one hand and a barely glanced-at list in the other. He was not there to fall in love. He was there to order chrysanthemums for a funeral wreath. But Suyin looked up from the arrangement she was working on, white ranunculus, he would later remember because he didn't usually notice things like flower names, and she said, "Good morning. What can I help you find today?" And something in the way she said it, simply, directly, without any trace of the performance or caution that most people put on when he walked into a room, made Park Junho stop. Just stop. He stood there for a moment longer than he should have. And she waited, patient and unhurried, scissors still in her hand. He ordered the funeral arrangement. He returned the following week for a table arrangement for a business dinner. And the week after that, for no reason he could have fully explained, he came back again. He didn't tell anyone. That was the first extraordinary thing about what was happening inside Park Junho. This was a man whose every movement was tracked, accounted for, and known to at least 3 members of his inner circle at all times. Not for his protection alone, but because information was infrastructure in his world. Every appointment, every meeting, every dinner, logged and coordinated. But his visits to Suyin's flowers? He went alone. He started varying his route, leaving earlier than necessary, telling his driver he needed 20 minutes. 20 minutes that he spent in a small flower shop on an unremarkable street, talking to a woman who had no idea who he really was. And that, perhaps, was the most intoxicating part of it. To Suyin, he was simply Mr. Park, a businessman, polite, slightly formal, clearly someone with money, but she'd had wealthy customers before. They weren't special to her on account of their bank accounts. What made her pay attention to Mr. Park was something else. He asked questions, not the distracted, half-listening questions that busy people ask while scrolling through their phones. He asked about the flowers. What made one variety different from another in terms of care? What the language of certain blooms had been across different cultures? What she thought, not what was popular, not what sold well, but what she thought made a truly beautiful arrangement. Nobody in Junho's life asked him what he thought. They told him what they believed he wanted to hear. They anticipated and performed and calculated. Suyin just talked to him. One afternoon in April, he had been visiting for over a month now. She was working on a wedding centerpiece and asked him, almost absently, whether he believed in the idea of flowers as emotional communication. Whether he thought there was something real in the old Victorian tradition of flower meanings, florography, or whether it was just romantic nonsense. Junho considered this with the same seriousness he would have applied to a financial proposal. "I think anything that helps people say what they can't say out loud has real value," he replied. She looked up at him. "That's a surprisingly thoughtful answer for a man who came in to buy funeral flowers the first time I met him." He almost smiled. "Almost. Funerals are when people realize they should have said more," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes. I think that's the saddest thing about them." He thought about that conversation for 3 days. By May, he was ordering flowers he didn't need, arrangements for lobbies of offices he barely visited, bouquets for events he fabricated, anything that gave him a reason to be there, in that small warm shop that smelled like earth and petals, sitting across from a woman who treated him like he was simply human. He started learning her schedule. He learned that her assistant came in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, which meant she was usually alone on Wednesday afternoons. He started coming on Wednesdays. He learned that she played old Korean folk music quietly while she worked, that she kept a small orange cat named Jul, meaning tangerine, who slept in a basket behind the counter, that she took her coffee with no sugar and too much milk and always made a face at the first sip, as if it surprised her every time. He noticed that she hummed when she was concentrating. He noticed that she always touched the petals of a flower very gently before she cut the stem, as if apologizing to it. He noticed too many things. And he said nothing. Because what could he say? What could he offer her? He was a man who ran an empire that would imprison or destroy everything she was if it ever came close to her. He had spent 22 years making sure that the people who loved him either feared him too much to show it, or were paid well enough not to care. He had no framework for this, no strategy, no way to calculate the risk-to-reward ratio of whatever was happening in his chest every Wednesday afternoon. So he stayed silent about it. He kept it perfect and contained, the way he kept everything. He watched her from a careful distance, in the only space he had allowed himself, across a wooden counter scattered with flower clippings and ribbon, in a shop that felt like the inside of a life he had never chosen. He never intended for anyone to know. And for nearly 8 months, no one did. His name was Kong Do-hyun, 38 years old, second-generation wealth, His father had built a mid-sized construction empire that Do-hyun had expanded aggressively into real estate development. He was educated, polished, and possessed the specific confidence of a man who had never in his life been told no. He was also in the intricate ecosystem of Seoul's elite social world, adjacent to Park Junho's circle. Not inside it, but close enough to have attended some of the same events, nodded across some of the same rooms. Do-hyun had nothing to do with the underground. He was simply a wealthy man who liked beautiful things and made no apology for pursuing them. He had first come into Suyin's shop in June, referred by a client of hers who admired her work, looking for floral arrangements for his new penthouse apartment in Gangnam. He was charming. He was generous with his compliments and generous with his budget. He returned twice more to discuss the project, and each time he stayed a little longer. By July, he was bringing her coffee. By August, he had asked her to dinner. Suyin was cautious. She liked Do-hyun well enough. He was interesting company, clearly intelligent, and she appreciated that he was straightforward about his intentions. She wasn't swept off her feet, but she was human. She was 34, and she had been alone for a while, and here was an attractive, attentive man who was making it very clear that he found her remarkable. She said yes to dinner. She told no one. It was a first date, not an announcement. But in a city like Seoul, where enough people know enough people, these things travel. The information reached Park Junho on a Tuesday evening in September. Not deliberately, not as a warning, but simply as casual conversation between two of his associates who had seen Suyin and Do-hyun at a restaurant in Hanam-dong the weekend before. They were discussing a real estate deal. Kang Do-hyun's name came up. One of the men mentioned having seen him recently. Said something about a pretty florist he seemed to be pursuing. Junho said nothing. He kept his face perfectly still. But something shifted in his chest, something that moved through him like cold water, fast and total, an impossible stop. He didn't sleep that night. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he had no claim on Suyin's life, no right to any feeling about who she spent her time with. He told himself this multiple times, very firmly, the way you repeat something you're trying to make true. It didn't work. By morning, he had done what he always did when something bothered him. He gathered information. He now knew the restaurant, the date, the approximate length of the dinner, whether they had left together. They hadn't. She had taken her own car home. He noted this with more relief than he wanted to admit. He knew that Do-hyun had called her twice since then. He knew she had agreed to a second date the following Friday. And knowing all of this, sitting with all of this information in his perfectly appointed office on the 34th floor of a building he owned, Park Junho felt something he had not felt since he was 12 years old, running messages for a man who could destroy him. He felt helpless. This is the part of the story where Park Junho, a man of almost legendary self-control, made a mistake. His first real mistake in 22 years. He made it not with violence, not with calculation, not with any of the tools that had built his empire. He made it with emotion, that oldest and most treacherous of human weapons. He used his resources. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have raised any flag to an outside observer. But to the man who had carefully, secretly held feelings for Suyin for 8 months, it was a profound crossing of a line he had not even consciously drawn until he crossed it. He had one of his people approach Kang Do-hyun. Not threaten, not harm, but apply pressure. A business deal that Do-hyun was pursuing, a land development project in Yongin, quietly ran into unexplained municipal obstacles. A partner who had been eager to sign suddenly became unavailable. The timeline began to stretch in ways that cost money. Real money. The kind of friction that could be traced if you knew where to look, back to a single source. Junho's intention, if it can even be called an intention, was simply to distract Do-hyun, to fill his time with business problems, to give him something else to focus on besides a florist in Mapo. It worked, in the narrow tactical sense. Do-hyun canceled the second date, then a third. He was genuinely preoccupied with the unraveling deal and genuinely unaware that the two things were connected. For approximately 3 weeks, Junho told himself he had solved a problem. But problems have a way of growing in the dark. Because Kang Do-hyun was not a man who accepted unexplained losses without investigation. He hired people to look into the obstacles with his Yongin project. And those people good at their jobs began to follow threads. The threads led to a wall. And the pattern of how the wall was built, the specific texture of it, the way the pressure had been applied, looked familiar to a certain type of investigator. Familiar in a way that pointed not to a competitor in real estate, but to something else entirely. Something bigger. Do-hyun was not a stupid man. He began to ask quiet questions among people he trusted. And within 2 weeks, he had pieced together enough to understand, not with certainty, but with deep, chilling suspicion, that someone in an entirely different category of power had a reason to want him away from Lee Soo-yeon's flower shop. He didn't know Park Junho's name. Not yet. But he knew the shape of the intervention. And he started watching. Meanwhile, on a Wednesday afternoon in October, Park Junho walked into Soo-yeon's shop. She was at the back, arranging dahlias. She called out a greeting without turning around. She recognized his footsteps by now, which was a detail that struck him differently now than it might have 3 months ago. He sat on the small stool near the counter, his stool, the one she'd started leaving clear on Wednesdays, and watched her work. "You look tired," she said, still not turning around. "I've had a complicated few weeks," he said. "The kind that keep you awake, or the kind that exhaust you and still keep you awake?" "The second kind." She turned then, looked at him the way she looked at flowers when she was deciding what they needed. "Are you taking care of yourself?" The question landed somewhere unexpected. No one asked him that. No one ever asked him that. It wasn't a question that existed in his world, where he was either an asset or a threat, never a person who might need looking after. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Not particularly," he admitted. She handed him a small cup of coffee she'd just made, the bad kind, too much milk, first sip always a surprise, and said, "Sit. I'll finish this, and then you can tell me about your terrible few weeks if you want to. Or you don't have to. Either way, you look like you need to sit somewhere quiet for a minute." He sat. He stayed for 2 hours. He didn't tell her the truth. He told her a version, about a business situation that had gotten complicated, about a decision he'd made that he wasn't sure was right. He kept it abstract. She didn't push for details. She asked questions about how he felt about it, not what had happened, not who was at fault, but how he felt, and the conversation went somewhere so far outside his usual experience that he felt slightly dizzy by the time he left. Walking back to his car, Junho made a decision. He would tell her. Not everything. He was not naive about what full honesty would mean. But something. Something real. Because whatever this was between them, whatever it had been building to, he was not willing to leave it floating undefined anymore. He was not willing to watch her build a life with someone else while he sat on a wooden stool every Wednesday pretending he was there for flowers. He would tell her that he cared about her. He would let her decide what to do with that. It was, by any objective measure, the most terrifying decision Park Junho had ever made in his life. And it was the right one. But he was 2 weeks too late. Kang Do-hyun had been careful and patient. By the 3rd week of October, he had identified enough about the interference with his Yongin project to walk into the offices of a journalist he trusted, a senior investigative reporter at a major Seoul news outlet who covered organized crime and political corruption. A reporter who had spent 6 years trying to build a case against the underground networks that controlled large segments of Seoul's financial ecosystem. Do-hyun didn't give the reporter Park Junho's name. He didn't have it yet. But he gave the reporter the shape, the financial fingerprints, the pattern of pressure, the names of the municipal contacts who had been activated. He gave the reporter enough to start pulling the thread properly. And the reporter, who had been waiting years for exactly this kind of structural information, pulled it. Fast. Within 4 days, the reporter had connected 3 separate incidents of unexplained business disruption over the past 18 months, all involving individuals who had at some point come into contact with a particular suite of holding companies in Gangnam. The holding companies belonged, on paper, to various shell entities. But the shell entities had a center, a spine, a name. The reporter had his story. He had Park Junho. What happened next moved with the terrible speed that these things always move with once they start, the kind of speed that seems impossible until it's happening, and then seems like it was always inevitable. The story broke on a Friday morning. Not a small story. A front-page, hours-long, cross-platform event, a detailed investigative piece backed by financial documents, source testimony, and a timeline that laid out Park Junho's operations with a clarity and specificity that made it clear someone with detailed knowledge had contributed. The piece didn't name Do Hyun. It didn't need to. It named Park Junho. It named his companies, his associates, his methods. It traced the invisible web he had spent 22 years weaving through Seoul's business and political infrastructure with patient, devastating clarity. By Friday afternoon, law enforcement agencies that had been circling Junho's world for years suddenly found that every door they'd knocked on for a decade had swung open. Arrests began that evening. Junho himself was not immediately arrested. He had lawyers mobilized within minutes of the story breaking, and he moved with practiced efficiency to protect himself legally. But the walls were closing. He knew it. Every person who had ever been afraid of him was suddenly, rapidly realigning. The calls he made went unanswered. The doors he knocked on didn't open. 22 years of carefully cultivated loyalty began to dissolve in real time. He was in his office on Friday evening, alone, for the first time in recent memory, because even his closest associates were now managing their own exposure, when his phone showed an incoming call from a number he recognized immediately. It was Suyin. He stared at the screen for 2 full rings. She was calling him. She had never called him. He had never given her his real number, only a secondary phone. But she was calling that phone now, and the fact that she was calling meant she had seen the news. Or someone had told her. Or, he answered, Mr. Park. Her voice was quiet, careful, not frightened exactly, but something in it had changed. Something had shifted in the way she said his name. Suyin. A pause. I saw the news this morning, she said, about a man named Park Junho, a businessman in Gangnam. Another pause. He comes in on Wednesdays. He orders more flowers than anyone I've ever had as a customer. He keeps a stool warm for 2 hours and drinks terrible coffee and asks me about florography. Junho was silent. Is that you? She asked. He could have lied. He was exceptionally good at lying. He had built 22 years on the architecture of strategic untruths and careful omissions. But her voice was asking him something beyond just the name, something underneath the name. Who are you really? Who have you been sitting in my shop all these months? And he found, to something like his own amazement, that he couldn't do it. Yes, he said, that's me. The silence that followed lasted long enough for him to hear her exhale slowly. Then I think, she said, you should tell me the truth. All of it, and I'll decide what I think after. He told her, not the full architecture, not the specifics that would have implicated her by knowledge, but the truth of who he was and what he'd built. He told her about Incheon and the dock workers and the 12-year-old boy who wanted to matter. He told her about 22 years of choosing power over everything else. He told her about Kang Do Hyun and the Yongan Project and the thing he had done from jealousy, that word jealousy, sitting in his mouth like something foreign, something he'd never had occasion to say out loud before. He told her that he had cared about her. That Wednesday afternoons in her shop had been the only hours in years that he had felt like a human being rather than a function. That he was sorry. That he knew sorry wasn't enough. And Suyin listened to all of it, quietly, the way she listened to everything, fully, without interrupting, without performing a reaction until she had one that was real. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You used your power to push someone away from me, she finally said. Not angry. Something more complicated than angry. Sad maybe. Certain. Yes. Without telling me. Without asking me. Without trusting me to make my own choices. Yes. Another silence. That's not love, Mr. Park, she said. That's ownership. And the difference matters. The legal proceedings against Park Junho took 14 months. They were thorough, well-documented, and ultimately unavoidable. The financial investigators worked methodically through the shell companies, the holding entities, the 2 decades of layer transactions. The political and business figures who had long benefited from his network quietly settled with prosecutors before they could be publicly identified. Several of his closer associates faced charges. Junho cooperated with a significant portion of the investigation, a decision made partly by his legal team and partly by something his lawyers found harder to explain. He seemed, they later said to colleagues, like a man who had made a decision, not to destroy himself gratuitously, but to stop performing an identity he no longer believed in. He served 4 years of a 7-year sentence with reductions for cooperation and good behavior. He was 53 when he walked out of prison. The empire was gone. The companies had been dissolved or sold. The associates had scattered. The carefully maintained public persona of the civic-minded businessman had been publicly and thoroughly dismantled. What was left was a man. Just a man. He had used the prison years the way he used everything, with attention and purpose. He had read extensively. He had spoken to a therapist for the first time in his life, voluntarily, not as a legal requirement, and discovered, somewhere in those conversations, that the 12-year-old boy who had wanted to matter had never actually stopped running that errand, had never actually got what he was looking for. He thought about his parents often. His mother, who had taken in laundry. His father, who had worked the docks. They had been tired, yes, but they had loved each other clearly and specifically and without strategy. He thought about that. He thought about Suyin often, too. Not with the sharp, possessive ache of the jealous man he had been on that Tuesday evening in September when he'd heard her name linked to Do Hyun's, but with something quieter, something honest. He had never deserved her Wednesday afternoons. He knew that now. He had taken up space in her life under false pretenses. Not maliciously, not with a plan, but out of a need he hadn't even understood himself until it was too late. He had used proximity as a substitute for honesty. He had let himself receive her warmth without ever offering her the truth about who she was receiving it from. And then when he felt threatened, he had used power instead of words. She had been right. That wasn't love. That was ownership. And the difference did matter. Somewhere during his 2nd year of incarceration, he wrote her a letter. 1 page. Handwritten. No requests, no appeals, no strategies. Just an acknowledgement of what had happened and what he had taken from her. Not money, not safety, but something more precise. The chance to know the person she had genuinely liked across that counter. The chance to decide, with full information, what she thought of him. He had stolen that from her, by hiding. And then he had doubled the theft by using his network to manage her choices without her knowledge. He wrote that he hoped she was well. He wrote that Jewel the cat, if still alive, deserved excellent treatment. He wrote that he had genuinely meant it when he said that funerals were sad because people realized they should have said more. He sent it. He didn't expect a reply. He didn't ask for one. 3 months later, one arrived. It was brief. 3 paragraphs. Her handwriting was unhurried and clear, the handwriting of someone who thought before she wrote. She said she had read his letter more than once. She said she had thought about it, about the Wednesday afternoons, about the conversations, about the person across the counter who had asked about florography and sat with terrible coffee like he had nowhere more important to be. She said she had spent a long time being angry, and then a longer time being sad, and then a long time simply trying to understand. She said she didn't know what he was to her. She didn't try to name it. She said that Jewel was doing well. He had recently knocked an entire arrangement of white peonies off the counter and seemed to have no remorse. She said she hoped he was finding something real in whatever he was doing now. She did not say anything beyond that, but she had written back. Now, if you've stayed with us this long, and we hope you have, you know that we don't tell stories here simply because they're dramatic. We tell them because there's always something underneath the drama that's worth sitting with. And the real story here, underneath the empire and the jealousy and the exposure and the courtrooms, is something much smaller, much more universal. It's a story about a man who spent 22 years building walls so high that he forgot what was on the other side of them. About what happens when a person constructs an identity around power and control and then encounters someone, some ordinary, unhurried, pedal-touching, cat-owning, bad coffee-drinking person who sees through none of the performance because she never had any reason to perform. Because Suyin didn't know who Park Junho was. And in not knowing, she saw him. The part of him that was simply a person who wanted to sit somewhere quiet and be asked what he thought. That is worth pausing on. How many of us build versions of ourselves for the world? Not criminal versions, not dramatic ones, just the protective layers that accumulate over years of needing to appear more capable or more invulnerable or more certain than we actually are. And how rarely someone sees past that. And what happens to us when they do? Park Junho's mistake was not falling for a florist. His mistake was in believing that what he felt for her entitled him to make decisions about her life. That love, or whatever name we give to that warm and pulling gravity between two people, that it comes with a deed to the other person, that it is something to manage. Soo-yeon was right. That's not love. Love, real love, is the thing that says, I see you clearly, and I want you to be free. It says, here is the truth of who I am. Do with it what you will. It is terrifying precisely because it offers no control over the outcome. It requires the one thing that a man like Park Junho had spent a lifetime avoiding. Vulnerability. Not weakness. Not surrender. But the specific, terrifying act of being known. And that act, that honest, quiet, 2-paragraph letter written from a prison cell, was perhaps the first genuinely courageous thing Park Junho ever did. Not any of the calculated empire building. Not the 2 decades of untouchable power. Not even the cooperation with prosecutors. The letter, written knowing she might never respond. Written anyway. That was the bravest thing. Because what are we when we strip away everything we've built and accumulated and performed, all the status, all the strategy, all the carefully managed appearances? We are people who want someone to ask us how we're doing and mean it. We are people who want to sit somewhere quiet and be seen. We are all, underneath everything, a little like that 12-year-old boy in Incheon, wanting to matter, wanting to be trusted with something that means something, wanting, if we're honest, someone to hand us a cup of coffee and say, you can tell me or you don't have to. Either way, sit here for a minute. Music softens to background level. Now we want to hear from you. This story raises something that I think a lot of us carry quietly, that question of what we hide and why, and what it costs us. Have you ever built walls so high that you lost track of what was behind them? Have you ever cared about someone and expressed it the wrong way, through control instead of honesty? Or have you ever been on Soo-yeon's side, the person who found out that someone they'd trusted wasn't who they seemed, and had to decide what to do with that? What would you have done in her situation? Would you have written back? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and we genuinely mean that. Some of the best conversations on this channel happen right there under the video. Real people, real thoughts, no filters. And stay with us until the end, because we've got one more piece of the story. One detail that came out much later, that changes the way you see everything that came before. There's one more thing. One detail that journalists who followed the story discovered in the course of their research. A small thing, easily missed in the larger narrative of criminal empires and legal proceedings. In the year before the story broke, in the months when Park Junho was visiting a flower shop on Wednesdays and sitting on a wooden stool and drinking terrible coffee, he had been quietly, carefully setting something in motion. Using his considerable financial resources, he had established a trust fund. Not for himself, not for any of his associates, but for a small non-profit organization based in Incheon, his hometown, that provided vocational training and educational support to children from low-income families along the waterfront. Children very like he had been. 12-year-old kids looking for a way to matter. The fund was anonymous, set up through enough layers that it could not be easily traced to him, and at the time of its creation, he clearly intended it to stay that way. It wasn't a PR move. There was no press release. There was no charity gala photo. It was just money quietly given to kids who needed a different kind of errand to run. The trust continued operating through the legal proceedings and afterward, protected at his instruction by legal barriers that ensured it couldn't be seized as criminal asset regardless of what happened to him. His lawyers had puzzled over this at the time. It had been a very specific, very deliberate arrangement. When reporters eventually uncovered it and asked his lawyer about it, the lawyer said only that his client had not wanted that particular thing undone. Nobody knew exactly when he'd set it up. Some of the paperwork suggested late February, maybe early March. Around the time, give or take, of a Thursday morning when he had walked into a flower shop to order chrysanthemums. We don't know if the two things were connected. Maybe it's a coincidence. Or maybe, something about sitting across from a woman who treated him like a human being reminded him of the human beings he had walked past for 22 years. Maybe it reminded him what it felt like to have nothing and to still deserve something. Maybe Soo-yin's presence in his life, even the quiet, uncomplicated presence of it, woke something up that his empire had put to sleep. We'll never know for certain, but we think about it. We think about the idea that the most powerful changes in a person rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with drama and declaration. They arrive on a Wednesday afternoon in a small shop that smells like earth and petals when someone asks what you think and actually waits to hear the answer. Park Junho spent 22 years building walls. And they came down, in the end, not because of law enforcement or journalism or financial forensics. They came down because a woman with dark eyes and bad coffee and a cat named Tangerine looked at him across a counter and saw a person. That is the most dangerous thing in the world, and the most necessary. To all the people in your life who see you, really see you, past the performance, past the walls, past the careful management of how you appear. Hold on to them. Not tightly, not possessively, but honestly. Tell them the truth. Ask them what they think, and wait for the answer. Sit on the stool. Drink the terrible coffee. Let yourself be known. Because you might not get 22 years to waste before you figure out that was the whole point. Warm, direct tone, like wrapping up a conversation with a friend. If this story moved you, if any part of it stayed with you, we'd love to know. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one, and every single click matters more than you might think. Leave a comment and tell us, which moment in this story hit you hardest? Was it the flower shop? The letter? The trust fund? Or something else entirely? We want to know. Subscribe to Dad Life Stories if you haven't already. We cover the full range of human experience here. The extraordinary lives behind ordinary faces. The love stories hiding inside cautionary tales. The real people underneath the headlines. And share this video with someone who you think needs to hear it today. You probably know someone. We all do. We'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. And say something true to someone today while you still can.